The stranger at the fence. The wind off the Big Horn Mountains had teeth that afternoon, sharp and clean, cutting through the Wyoming Territory like it meant to strip the land bare. Quentyn Granger reined in his bay just beyond the north pasture, squinting toward a movement along the fence line. At first he thought it was a coyote, lean and slow-moving, dragging something heavy behind it. But as the gust shifted, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and iron nails, he saw her small upright, determined, hauling a battered carpet bag that sagged near to tearing. The thing must have been heavy with more than clothes, because it carved a deep line through the red dirt as she walked, each step deliberate, like she had all the time in the world and no choice but to spend it here. She didn't look up when his shadow crossed the ground in front of her. Quentyn shifted in the saddle, set his weight in one stirrup, and called down, voice roughened by dust and long days. "I ain't hiring," he said flatly, "and I sure as hell don't need another mouth to feed." The words were meant to send her packing quick and clean. He'd seen enough drifters with stories that ended in someone else's trouble, but this one didn't flinch, didn't break stride. Only when she reached the fence post nearest his boot did she lift her chin slow and deliberate to meet his gaze. Her eyes were dark steady under the shade of a bonnet powdered with dust. "I'm not asking for work," she said, voice even and almost polite. "I'm asking for water." That gave him pause. He studied her a moment. Couldn't have been more than 22 skin, browned by miles, but not the soft kind of brown that came from idle summers. This was the shade you earned walking through wind and sun without shelter. Her dress had once been a blue calico, now faded to the color of an old sky, the hem torn in places where the thread had long since surrendered. Boots worn thin at the toe, cracked at the seam. But there was something about her posture, straight as a fence post, that said she'd sooner break than bend. Quentyn rubbed a thumb along his rein. "Well," he muttered after a beat, "I ain't heartless. Come on." He swung down from the saddle boots, hitting dirt with a soft thud, and led the bay toward the well house. She followed without a word, the drag of her carpet bag leaving a faint groove in the earth between them. At the well he pumped until water spilled cold into the tin dipper, then held it out. She took it without touching his hand, sipped slow, careful, like someone raised to mind their manners, even when the rest of their world had gone to ruin. She didn't gulp or waste a drop, just swallowed, set the dipper down, and wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. "What's your name?" he asked, folding his arms. "Eta Jameson," she replied. "I'm from Kansas. That. So. And what brings you to the edge of nowhere?" She looked at him fully now, as there was no shame in her tone when she said, "I walked here." "You what I walked?" she repeated like she'd say it as many times as it took for him to believe her. "Took me near 3 weeks. I'm not looking for charity. Just need a place to rest a night or two. Then I'll be on my way." Quentyn studied her, this stranger who spoke plain, asked for nothing more than a corner to breathe in. "You can sleep in the barn," he said at last, jerking his head toward the low structure beyond the corral. "Mind the horses, and don't touch anything that ain't yours." "I'm not helpless," she answered. "No," he said, turning back toward the corral. "You're something else entirely." The days. She didn't leave. Quentyn had figured she'd be gone by sunrise. That's how these things usually went, a night in the barn, maybe a blanket borrowed, an apple, or 2 gone missing, then nothing but the faint tracks of boots fading toward the horizon. But the next morning, when he stepped out to tend the horses, he found her already there. Eta was sweeping out the barn with an old straw broom, her carpet bag pushed neatly against the wall. Dust drifted in the shaft of light, spilling through the open door, catching in her hair. She didn't look up when he passed, just kept working in slow, measured strokes. By mid-morning, the barn floor looked cleaner than it had in months. The second day, she was outside before him, again crouched by the chicken coop. One of the hinges had given out years back, and he'd just grown used to lifting the door by hand. But she was there with a hammer working a new nail into place. He almost told her to leave it, but something in the way she moved, sure patient, kept him quiet. On the fourth day, he found her in the yard, chopping kindling with an axe nearly half her weight. Her sleeves were rolled, exposing forearms roped with wiry muscle. She swung clean-split each log in one stroke and set the pieces aside in a neat stack. "You know this isn't your land," he said from the porch, leaning on the post. "I know," she answered without looking up. "You planning to stay? I have nowhere else," she said simply. "You told me you'd move on." "I lied." He blinked at that. No excuses, no flinch, just the truth laid out plain. "Well, damn," he muttered. That evening, for the first time, she sat at his table. She ate quietly, chewing each bite like it mattered, but there was no timidness in her manner. When he asked about family, her answer was quick, unvarnished. Her stepfather had sold everything after her mother died, leaving her and a little brother behind. The boy, Oliver, had been 9 when the sheriff said fever took him. She thought it was hunger. Buried him out behind the schoolhouse herself. The room went still after that, the only sound the flicker of the oil lamp between them. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," she said. "I just need to be somewhere. I don't disappear." Quentyn met her eyes, saw the truth there. "All right," he said finally. "Then stay. The quiet work of staying." From that point on, it was as if she'd always been there. Eta moved through the ranch like water, finding the low ground, quiet, steady, filling in what needed doing without ever being told. She patched the hole in the roof where the last storm had torn shingles loose. She dug post holes along the south pasture and tamped them herself. And one afternoon, when he came in from checking the north fence, he found her by the porch with his old Winchester resting against her knee, the stock polished, the barrel cleaned. "You know how to handle that?" he asked. "I wouldn't touch it if I didn't," she replied, never looking up from her work. It wasn't just the labor. She listened, sometimes in silence, sometimes with questions that cut right to the bone. Quentyn found himself telling her things he hadn't said aloud in years, about writing dispatch for the Union, about the mining collapse that killed his brother in Colorado, about how he'd bought this land with the last of his army pay and never looked back. In return, she told him about the creek behind her old home in Kansas, about smuggling bread to Oliver when her stepfather wasn't looking, about the way her mother used to sing while hanging the wash. Her voice was low when she spoke of those things, but never sentimental. She didn't tell stories to make herself pitiable. She told them because they were true. One afternoon, he found her on her hands and knees in the cabin, scrubbing the floor with a rag until the wood showed clean beneath. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." He crouched beside her. "You really not planning to leave?" She met his gaze. "Do you want me to?" He hesitated. "I thought you were a joke. First day I saw you, figured you were either crazy or desperate." "I was both," she said, wringing out the rag. "But I stayed." He felt something tighten behind his ribs, something he couldn't name yet. You're not a joke. I know that too. The storm and the firelight. The first thunder came like a crack of cannon fire rolling across the open valley before slamming into the cabin walls. Quentyn had been mending a saddle strap by the hearth when the wind shifted, carrying with it the low moan of trees bowing against the force. The lamps flickered. Rain began to slap against the windows in sharp bursts, the kind that stung if you were caught outside. When he glanced toward the narrow glass above the kitchen table, he saw her Eta standing still as a shadow, arms folded across her chest. The light from the storm lit her in silver, the fine lines of her face stark against the darkness inside. Her eyes tracked the lightning before it split the sky again. "I don't like storms," she said, her voice flat but not cold, the tone of someone confessing an old scar rather than a present fear. Quentyn set the saddle aside and crossed the room. He didn't touch her at first, just stood beside her, watching the dark shapes of the cottonwoods sway in the wind. "Then come sit by the fire," he said, his voice low enough to be heard over the rain. She turned her head slightly, like she wasn't sure he was serious. When he didn't move away, she let him guide her to the hearth. The fire popped and hissed heat, pushing back the chill that had crept in through the walls. He sat first, leaning his forearms on his knees, and she settled beside him. For a while, they didn't speak. The storm took up all the space, a rattling chorus of wind and water, the occasional boom of thunder close enough to make the floorboards shiver. Then, without ceremony, her fingers found his. It wasn't a tentative brush, not a testing of the water. It was a quiet, sure clasp, as if she'd already decided what she meant by it. Her hand was warm. Work roughened the pads of her fingers, calloused in a way that told him she'd known hard labor, longer than she'd known comfort. He closed his hand around hers, his thumb resting lightly over her knuckles. When she leaned her head against his shoulder, he didn't shift away. The weight of her there felt right, like something that had been missing without him realizing it. "You're not alone anymore," he murmured. "I know," she breathed, and he felt the shape of the words against his sleeve. He turned his head, catching the scent of her hair, faintly of wood smoke and the lavender soap she must have found under the sink days ago. The firelight caught in her eyes when she lifted her face to him, and for a moment the storm faded into something distant. Then she kissed him. It was soft at first, certain without being hurried. When she drew back, she looked at him like she was memorizing the angles of his face, as if she needed to be sure he was real. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly, his palm cupping her cheek. "Neither are you." The second kiss came slower, deeper, their breath mingling in the warm glow of the hearth. Outside, the wind clawed at the roof, but inside the air, held still the only movement, the pull of them toward each other. When she finally settled into his side, curled beneath his arm, Quentyn stopped trying to fit this into any notion of chance or passing time. Whatever had brought her to his fence line that day had left her here in his home in the circle of his arm, and that was enough. The storm would pass. The fire would burn down. But the weight of her against him felt like something that could last, looking east and riding the herd. The days after the storm carried a kind of quiet that felt earned. The air was sharp in the mornings, the ridges beyond the pasture already carrying a faint dusting of snow that refused to melt by midday. On the first morning of October, Quentyn came out onto the porch and found Eta standing at the paddock fence, her breath rising in slow clouds. She had her hands tucked into the pockets of her skirt, gaze fixed toward the horizon east toward Kansas. She didn't move when he leaned against the porch post. "You keep looking that way," he said. "Expecting Kansas to catch fire and send someone after you?" She didn't turn. "No one's coming. Just a habit." He walked down the steps, boots crunching on frost-hardened grass. "You waiting for something else, then? Just trying to figure if I belong," she said, eyes still on the Ridgeback Trail. "I worked hard to get here, but sometimes I wonder if I'm still just passing through." "You've been here near a month," he said. "That stopped feeling like passing through, yet." Eta finally glanced over her shoulder. The corner of her mouth lifted, not a smile exactly, but something quieter, more personal. "Not sure what it feels like yet." He nodded once and reached for the gate latch. "Well, the cows don't care either way. They still need moving to the lower pasture." They rode out together, the cold biting at their ears, the kind of silence between them that felt companionable rather than empty. Her gelding moved sure-footed along the slope, and she sat the saddle like someone who'd been riding longer than she'd been walking. The herd was slow to move, but she didn't push. She whistled, low clicked her tongue, and the cattle shifted at her voice like they'd known it all along. At the creek, she swung down without being told, breaking the thin skin of ice along the bank with a flat stone so the cattle could drink. Quentyn watched her from the saddle. "You ever think about teaching?" he asked. "Children," she said without looking up. "No. Horses? Ranch hands? Me? I don't know how to teach," she said, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I just do what needs doing." "That's a kind of teaching," he said, dismounting to help. They worked the herd across the water, slow, steady. Her strength wasn't in her size or speed, but in her efficiency, never wasting motion, always seeing what needed doing before it happened. He'd seen men with a decade more experience make twice the noise and half the progress. Back at the barn, she lifted her saddle off the gelding and winced. "You hurt?" he asked. "Not hurt, just tired in places I didn't know I had. You don't have to ride every day." "I want to," she said simply. He stepped close to hang the bridle, their shoulders brushing. She didn't pull away. "You're not just staying here for shelter," he said. "No," she answered softly. "I'm not. Tallying the winter and the first yes." That night she sat by the fireplace mending one of his trail shirts. The split along the shoulder had been there for months, but he'd never bothered with it. Her stitches were small and even the kind that would outlast the fabric itself. She didn't ask if he wanted it fixed. She simply threaded the needle and worked. "You ever think about what might come next?" he asked. She didn't look up. "I try not to." "Why not? Because it's easier to keep moving when you don't expect anything. What if something good's waiting?" She paused, set the needle down, and met his gaze. "Then I wouldn't know what to do with it." "You don't have to know," he said quietly. The next morning he found her in the root cellar, bent over the shelves sorting potatoes from onions. She'd started keeping tally on a scrap of ledger paper she'd found behind the stove. No one had asked her to. "I figure we've enough through New Year if we ration the flour," she said without looking up. He crouched beside her. "You planning to stay through winter? I was hoping you'd ask me to." He stood the floor, creaking under his boots. "I'm asking." She gave a slow nod, eyes still on the shelves. "Then I'll stay." No more needed saying. On Sunday, he hitched the wagon and drove them into town for supplies. He hadn't been since midsummer, and he could feel the weight of eyes as they rolled down the main street with her sitting beside him in a borrowed coat. But Ida didn't flinch. At the mercantile, she chose a length of muslin, a tin of buttons, and a bar of lye soap, paying with 3 coins she'd earned fixing a neighbor's fence. "You didn't need to buy for the house," Quentyn said as they loaded the wagon. "I wasn't buying for the house," she replied. "I was buying for me. And what's mine stays where I'm welcome." His jaw tightened at that, but he only said, "You're welcome." The snow started on the way back, soft flurries drifting over the road. She leaned into his shoulder without speaking, and he let the reins rest loose in his hands, knowing there wasn't anywhere else he'd rather be. The mittens and the south pasture. By November, the cold had taken root. The ground cracked underfoot in the mornings, and the creek behind the barn wore a thin sheet of ice even past noon. Eta had taken to rising before first light, working by the warm flicker of a lantern while the world outside still slept. One morning, Quentyn came out of the bedroom pulling on his shirt and found her at the table with a skein of wool wound around her knees. Her fingers moved quick and sure, knitting a pair of mittens from yarn that looked like it had been salvaged from an old sweater. He leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching her work. "You ever do anything just for yourself? I like keeping my hands busy," she said, without looking up. "That's not what I asked." She tied off the thumb of one mitten and glanced up. "I don't know what I'd do if I wasn't needed." Quentyn stepped into the light, his boots soft on the worn plank floor. "You ever think maybe being wanted is better than being needed?" Her needles paused mid-stitch. "That's not something I ever had reason to expect." "Well," he said, pulling out the chair across from her, "you've got reason now." She studied him a long moment, eyes steady, then looked back down at the wool and kept working. That afternoon, he saddled the bay and told her to ride with him. The sky was low and gray, the kind of light that made the land look endless. They headed toward the south edge of the pasture, where a stretch of ground sloped gently toward a line of bare chokecherry trees. The grass there had grown wild for years, broken only by the wind and the occasional deer trail. Quentyn swung down near the tree line, crouching to press a palm to the soil. "Been thinking," he said, "if we laid posts here and cleared out the brush, come spring we could open up another grazing stretch." Eta dismounted and crouched beside him, her fingers brushing the earth. "It's solid, no sink beneath. I was thinking we could do it together," he said, glancing at her. She looked at him sidelong. "You mean, come spring, I mean as something that's ours, not just work." She straightened, brushing her palms on her skirt. "I've never had land." "You've got hands that know how to hold it, though," he said. She turned toward the ridge, her gaze stretching out past the trees. "I wouldn't know where to begin." "You begin by staying," he told her. "That's the thing about land, it doesn't care where you came from. It just matters that you stay." That night, after the lamps were blown out and the fire had burned low, Eta sat in the quiet with the finished mittens in her lap. She turned them over in her hands, feeling the tightness of the stitches, the strength in the work. She didn't smile, didn't cry, just sat there as if learning the weight of something she'd never been allowed to keep before. The next morning she handed them to Quentyn without a word. He slipped them on, flexed his fingers once, and looked at her. "You made these to last." She nodded. That was the point, the letter from Cheyenne. A week after she'd handed him the mittens, the first letter came. The post rider dropped it at the fence line just after midday, his horse's breath puffing white in the cold. Quentyn was on the porch mending a saddle strap when Eta appeared from the yard, the envelope in her hand. "It's addressed to you," she said, holding it out. He took it, running his thumb over the paper. The handwriting was tight, the kind you saw from a man who measured his words before setting them down. The postmark read, Cheyenne. "That'll be from my cousin George," Quentyn said. "I didn't know you had kin still living." "Only just," he replied. "He's a wheelwright. Offered me a spot in his shop last year, work indoors for once." She folded her arms. "You thinking of taking it?" "No." He tore the letter open and scanned the contents, his jaw working as he read. "He's moving east. Wants to know if I'll buy the shop from him." Eta didn't speak, just stood there with her arms crossed, her breath a pale wisp in the air. Quentyn folded the paper in half and slid it into his coat pocket. "I won't leave land I've built with my own hands." "Not now." She nodded once, her eyes steady. "All right." That night they climbed up into the barn loft, bales of hay stacked high around them, the smell of horses warm in the air below. The wind rattled the siding, but inside the loft, the world felt contained the lamplight pooling soft across the wooden floor. Eta leaned against his shoulder, her weight familiar. Now her stillness a kind of trust. "Tell me something you were afraid to hope for," he said quietly. She was silent a long moment, her gaze fixed on the lantern flame. "Then a home I didn't have to earn with my body." Quentyn didn't move, didn't speak over her. "A place where no one waited for me to be useful before they let me stay." She continued, her voice even but low, like each word had to be coaxed up from deep inside. He turned to look at her, the lamplight catching in her eyes. "You don't have to prove anything to me." She shook her head slightly. "I don't know how to stop trying. We'll figure it out," he said, his tone firm but gentle. The wind shifted outside, tugging at the eaves, but the air between them held still. She reached for him, then not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet certainty that had been growing between them day by day. When he kissed her, he did it with care, the kind a man uses when he understands what's been taken before and means never to take again. She touched his face as if she were trying to memorize the lines of it, the warmth beneath her hand. Later, as they lay wrapped in an old wool blanket, her head on his chest, she traced the edge of one of the mittens still tucked in his coat pocket. "Maybe next spring," she murmured, "we plant something." He kissed the top of her head. "We'll plant it together." For the first time, she didn't feel like she was passing through. The fence line, the timber, and the news. By the time March sun began to soften the frost in the upper pasture, the days stretched longer and Quentyn's mind turned to the work ahead. One afternoon he took Eta out to a stretch of land he'd never done much with, just south of the ridge where a line of bare chokecherry trees marked the edge of the property. "This ground's been sitting here too long," he said, resting a boot on the lower rail of the fence. "If we cleared it and set posts, we could open up another grazing stretch." Eta crouched, her gloved hand brushing away loose soil. "It's solid, no sink beneath. You could work this without much trouble." "I was thinking we could do it together," he said. She looked up at him, one brow raised. "Come spring, I mean as something that's ours." He said the word lingering between them like a promise. Her gaze shifted back toward the slope, and for a long moment she didn't answer. "I've never had land," she said finally. "You've got hands that know how to hold it," he replied. A week later, the thaw was in full swing, and they borrowed a wagon from the neighboring ranch to haul timber from the mill near Big Trails. The road was rutted deep from winter's freeze, the team working hard to pull the load over the muddy stretches. They passed through the low valley where the cottonwoods grew thick, their bare limbs scratching at the gray sky. Quentyn kept one hand light on the reins, the other resting on his thigh. Eta sat beside him, wrapped in her heavy coat, her hands folded in her lap. She'd been quiet most of the ride, not the comfortable kind of quiet he'd grown used to, but the kind that felt like she was holding something back. "You've been quiet," he said finally. She kept her gaze on the road ahead. "I've been keeping something." He pulled back gently on the reins, bringing the team to a slow stop. The harness creaked, the horses stamping in the damp earth. "What is it?" "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure," she said. Her voice was even, but her fingers tightened in her lap. "But I'm sure now." He weighted his eyes on hers. "I think I'm carrying," she said. "Not far along. Maybe 2 months." Quentyn blinked, the words settling over him, slow and heavy. "Are you all right with it?" "I'm not afraid," she said, meeting his gaze without wavering. "Not like before. This time I'm not alone." He reached over, took her hand, and turned it palm up, pressing his lips to her knuckles. "You never will be again." They didn't speak for the rest of the ride, the creak of the wagon and the muffled thud of hooves filling the air between them. But when they reached the cabin and he helped her down, his hand lingered at the small of her back, protective and certain. That night, long after she'd fallen asleep beside him, Quentyn lay awake staring at the shadowed rafters. He'd never had a father past 14, and what he remembered was mostly belt straps and silence. But this would be different. He had Eta, and that made all the difference. Ruth's first days and the life they built. The summer that Ruth was born came in on the heels of a thunderstorm. The rain had broken the heat, leaving the air cool and sweet with the scent of damp earth and cottonwood leaves. Eta labored through the night with Quentyn's steady hands close by his voice, a quiet anchor in the storm of pain. There was no midwife within riding distance, so it was just the two of them, the glow of the oil lamp and the ticking of the mantel clock, mocking each passing moment. By dawn, the crying of a newborn filled the small room sharp and insistent. Quentyn wrapped the baby in a soft length of muslin Eta had sewn, weeks earlier, the edges hemmed with tiny even stitches. He placed her gently into Eta's arms, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. "She's got your eyes," Quentyn said, brushing his thumb over the downy curve of Ruth's cheek. "And your hands," Eta replied, tracing the tiny fingers that curled instinctively around hers. They didn't talk much that first day. Words felt too small to hold what had just happened. Ruth slept in a cradle by the bed, waking only to nurse or fuss, her dark eyes blinking slow at the world. The storm had passed, and sunlight poured in through the east window, catching on the fresh-cut beams of the house they'd built together. Life settled into a new rhythm in the weeks that followed. The days began early, with Eta tending to Ruth while Quentyn saw to the animals. He would come in smelling of hay and morning air, leaning over the cradle to see his daughter, the hard lines of his face softening into something almost boyish. Eta moved through the house with a quiet assurance, one arm often curled around Ruth, the other free to stir a pot on the stove or mend a shirt. She'd learned to do almost everything one-handed, though Quentyn was quick to take the baby when he saw the strain in her shoulders. Sometimes in the middle of the afternoon he would come in from the pasture just to sit with her, holding Ruth against his chest, while the little girl's breaths slowed into sleep. The land felt different now. It wasn't just his, it was theirs. The fence lines they'd talked about were taking shape, and the garden Eta had planned was already sprouting neat rows of green. The calendula bloomed bright by the doorstep, a flash of color against the wide sweep of prairie grass. On the cooler evenings, they would sit on the porch with Ruth bundled between them, watching the sky turn gold, then pink, then the deep blue of night. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like water, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Eta would rest her head on Quentyn's shoulder, her hand covering his where it rested on her knee. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was full enough. "I used to think I was just passing through," she said once, her voice low, almost to herself. Quentyn looked at her, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. And now she smiled faintly, turning her gaze back to the horizon. "Now I can't imagine leaving." Every morning she opened the east-facing window, first letting the light spill across the floor. The sunlight touched the cradle, the hearth, the table where they shared their meals. It felt like a promise one they'd made to each other without ever needing to put it into words. They never left. They never needed to, and they were never alone again.